I never thought I would speak about faith like it could be taken away from you. Faith had always been an atmosphere in our house. The way my father folded his hands before he cooked. The way morning prayers smelled like coffee and onions. The way my mother kept an old hymnal face down on the kitchen table like a talisman. Our church was not a building to us at first. It was the place my father went while the rest of us slept. It was where he found the friends who felt like cousins and the quiet mouths that told him he was seen. When he died, the church was the thing left with the heartbeat still warm. My mother and I spent the first year after his funeral building rather than breaking. We sanded pews with our bare knuckles until splinters felt ordinary. We painted murals at dawn. We raised roofs and mended leaky gutters. The congregation said words about how much Dad had given, and we nodded and handed out coffee and sandwiches. There were nights I swore I could still hear him moving between the tables, telling someone to slow down with the salt. We were poor, and we were proud in the way small churches often are. We didn't have money, but we had mouths that laughed and hands that would blow a stranger's stove back into life. The pastor was a man everyone trusted before they ever met him. He was older than me, older than most of the congregation, and he had a face that could be crumpled into a story, lines at the eyes like the pages of our old hymnal. People called him Reverend Turner with reverence, and for reasons I refused to name then, I did too. He carried his suit with the kind of familiarity that makes a body seem made for clothes. He had a deep voice that made scripture sound like a poem, and he walked like someone who had already carried loss and come out the other side clean. He visited my mother every week with casserole and an armful of pity. He called me son with a softness that made my chest ache. He stood at my father's graveside and said the words a son should hear. When the church needed money, and it always did, Reverend Turner stood at the front and reminded everyone that faith asks for sacrifice. There were pledge drives and charity dinners and a jar by the coffee station that filled with bills from tired hands. My mother and I folded receipts into neat stacks and watched numbers become promises. We said prayers and passed the plate, thinking the plate was full because the people were generous. We promised ourselves that if we tightened our spending for 6 months, the church would be safe. Then one afternoon, on a whim or because grief had taught me to move without thinking, I walked into the Reverend's office to drop off some freshly laundered hymnals. The office was small and smelled like lemon oil and old paper. There were certificates on the wall and a photograph of him speaking on a stage to a crowd that had made me feel proud and small at the same time. I set the hymnals down, and that was the moment my life pivoted on a single bright edge. He was on the phone, low and fast, a voice like velvet. He did not see me at first. I paused at the door because of the tape recorder on his desk, an old thing someone had donated that recorded his sermons. The receiver was half off the hook, and the stereo light blinked. I shouldn't have been curious, not about an adult's life, but something in me moved forward. He hung up quickly when he noticed the recorder, and there was a small, private laugh that didn't belong with the reverence he wore on Sundays. I left, pretending I had only stopped in for hymnals, and I walked out into the sunlight that smelled of rain and spilled oil. I told myself to forget the laugh and the way his face had held a messenger's caution. I was loyal to him. He had been loyal to us. That was what we told ourselves. But the tape kept playing in my head like an unfinished hymn, and the next morning, I went back with the excuse that the hymnal had a stain and needed replacing. The office door was unlocked. The tape recorder was where I had left it. I told myself I was an idiot for being so curious. Then I pressed play because the world had a way of asking questions with the same gravity as a bullet. On the speaker a voice, the Reverend's, said something that made the skin on my arms go still. It was the low, conspiratorial cadence you only use with people you expect to obey you without question. "Move the funds to the Eastside account," he said. "Tell her it's for the roof. Tell no one. She trusts me. God trusts me. Do it tonight." Another voice I recognized then, A man's voice, soft and the kind of easiness that comes from habit, said, "It's done." She already gave the check. Then the tape clicked and a silence that was not silence followed, heavy and swollen. I pressed stop. I played it again. I told the room I was leaving, and I left, but I didn't move toward home. I walked until the cold had pushed itself between my spine and my ribs. The tape was a thing I could hold, his voice, a postal of theft, and the knowledge that the hand that had blessed my family had also been taking from it. I should have gone straight to my mother. I should have shouted and wept and warned her to burn everything. But there was another sound now, the sound of the church counting in a language I didn't yet speak. I needed more than the weight of one tape. I needed paper that could not be called memory when questioned. For 2 weeks I watched in silence. I counted. I watched the plate. I balanced ledgers myself at night by the dim light of a kitchen lamp, comparing deposit slips with the envelopes we had placed into the collection. The numbers didn't match. The roofs did not get repaired. The gutters still leaked. Pledges that had promised to cover the winter heater showed up as transfers to accounts I had never seen before. There were small differences at first. A few $100s moved here and there, but they formed a pattern if you let your eyes follow them. And then there was the other thing. The tape had done something to me else besides making me look at sums differently. It made me look at faces. He was the only man who came over to check on my mother at lunch. He laughed with us at the women's meetings and drew us closer like someone wrapping a blanket. So when a teenager at church mentioned offhandedly that he had seen Pastor Turner at a motel with my sister, I thought the world had tilted again in a smaller, sharper way. I did not ask the kid for proof. The question lodged in my throat like a stone. The thing people never tell you is how many ways you can be betrayed by the people who hold the keys to your life. You can be betrayed by words that sound holy, by numbers that look innocent in a ledger, by quiet hands that fold the plate. But to have someone sleep with your sister, and to do it as if the word sister were just another noun, there's a corrosion to that which you cannot wash with scripture. I watched them. I learned small things women teach each other while thinking they teach no one. How to watch a phone without looking like you are watching. How to let someone pass by close enough so that your body observes the angle of their shoulders. I found a string of texts on a phone left by chance on a kitchen table one Sunday. They read like a private sermon and a sorted calendar. I made a copy of everything I could lay my hands on: voice recording, emails, bank statements, the motel confirmation with a card that matched the signature on the church's donation sheet. I built a file like a wall, paper and pixels that refused to be argued down. Throughout that month, my mother floated between faith and fear. When I told her quietly that I had seen transfers that did not add up, she laughed like a person trying on someone else's grief. "He would not," she said. "He would not do such a thing." There was a stubborn grace to her denial. It felt like someone bracing themselves for a storm, while insisting the sky is only full of clouds. She clutched the hymnal as if its pages would stave off truth. She told neighbors, gently, that the Reverend had been a pillar and we would not speak ill of pillars. I could have raged at her then. The easiest path would have been to stand before the congregation like a prophet possessed and call down fire upon him. But there is a better cruelty in being patient when the world expects noise. I let the choir sing and the jars clink and the coffee flow. I went about mopping and sewing and painting and kept my mouth closed when someone complimented the Reverend's sermon. I wanted him to think he had quieted the small stone I had become. The night I decided to break the door of this quiet was not planned. My decision did not arrive with a neat checklist. It arrived because I happened to be delivering vegetables to the shelter across town, and the Reverend's car was there, a familiar black sedan I could never stand. The parking lot was empty, except for us and a flickering streetlight. Saw movement near the rear door and a silhouette that was not a man's. My sister's hair down, shoulders bare. I walked backward into shadow and pressed the recorder I had trained to my wrist to pick up the faintest of sounds. I should have run home. Instead, I sat in the car and listened. They spoke like lovers who have forgotten who they are harming. He said things in the same calm voice that people had heard in confessions and on good mornings. "You were always special," he murmured. My sister laughed, and in that laugh was a small cruelty I had not expected. I remember thinking then that there are things worse than financial theft. There's the reshaping of family into playthings. When I returned to the church the next morning, my hands shook with a cold that was not only because of the weather. I did not tell my mother. I did not yet because there were conversations I needed to have with myself. This was not merely about the Reverend's sin. It was about how a man who calls himself God's instrument had learned to use his instrument upon us. If I wanted justice watered by conviction rather than merely by accusation, I needed to be surgical. The following Sunday I sat in the third pew, the one my father used to reserve for himself, and kept my eyes on him as he preached. He wore a suit that looked newly pressed, and his voice filled the room like fog. My mother sat in the front row, hands clasped, eyes bright with the kind of faith that can only come from a place of deep wanting. She smiled when he smiled. I felt briefly something like vomiting at the sight. When the offering came, I rose. Not to place money in the plate, but to go to the front and speak. The murmurs were like wind at first, soft, shy, the way clothes rustle before dance. I walked to the lectern with a steadiness that surprised me. There was a small collective intake of breath, as if the room had suddenly realized a storm was standing in its doorway. The Reverend's eyes glanced at me with the complacency of a man who thought himself untouchable. He mouthed, "My son?" And everyone smiled because that was his assumed role in their story. I had the stack of papers in my hands. I had the recordings. I had the motel receipt and a printout of bank transfers that matched the dates with ministry collections. I had a small photograph a neighbor had taken of the Reverend's car late one night outside a motel on my sister's birthday. I had the text messages preserved by the phone carrier after a judge's subpoena, a thing I never thought I'd use, but which sat in my file like an instrument of truth. My hands did not tremble. My voice did not louden beyond what was necessary. I said plainly, "I stand here for what was our family's trust." The room needed a compass, so I gave it a simple map. I read the numbers out so people could calculate in their heads that the roof had not been paid for, but the account had been drained. The fundraiser's pledge that had covered utilities had traced to an offshore account. I played the voice file for them. The Reverend's voice, speaking to someone in the dark, said plainly how to conceal transfers and how to keep my mother blind. I read the motel confirmation number and the initials, and then the text messages on the screen. I said my sister's name into the microphone because she had not yet had a chance to speak for herself in that place. At first, there was confusion. A woman gasped. Someone stood, then sat. My mother's face did not change at first. She looked at me with the look of someone who had been handed a book in a language she did not know. Then the Reverend laughed, the small, practiced laugh of a man used to being defended. He said the words I had expected. "This is slander. This is false." He moved forward with a hand ready to command and a voice made to soothe. I watched him attempt to stitch the air back together with phrases he had used in sermons about forgiveness. I let him finish with the same quietness a surgeon listens to the instruments before an incision. When he paused for breath, I asked him to explain the bank transfers. I asked him to explain why the receipts of the fundraiser matched the motel's ledger. He opened his mouth, and his mouth made the first mistake of all great deceivers. He tried to spin a moral parable instead of answering a ledger. That was when I read the text aloud where he had called my sister by a pet name that no pastor would use. The room, which had been a warm place of murmurs, folded into a silence as if someone had pulled down a shade. My mother rose to her feet like a person whose legs had been propped when she was asleep. She demanded explanation. She clung to him with a fierceness that made some of the older women in the congregation lean forward in discomfort. For a moment she said words that were both familiar and grotesque. "I know him." "He would not." It looked for a moment as if a long prayer could hold back the tide. The policeman came quietly after someone in the crowd called. They had neutral faces because they had been trained to be neutral about faith, but their hands kept resting near the holsters because they had read more charges than comfort in the hush. They took statements. I provided them with copies of the records we had found. No one resisted the idea of an investigation because once the words are out of a church, they fall where the law and conscience can catch them. The Reverend's defense came in the form of lawyers and prayer bulletins, printed with ornate fonts and bedside visits from members who refused to see the cracks. He told people to pray first and to judge later, but we had numbers now, we had receipts. We had the voice that could speak across the congregation and be heard under the roof like the bitter truth. The news came 2 days later. The paper ran the story, "Local pastor under investigation." People wept in the pews, some cursed. The air tasted like iron. My sister stood quietly beside me, and she did not cry in front of the press. She did not play the role of the lost lamb or the fallen woman. She stood like a person who had been caught between love and protection and had found neither worthy. She said later, with an honesty that cleansed the dust in my chest, "I thought he loved me." That sentence, so simple and unbearable, made all the prayers of the previous years seem like newspaper pages blown into gutters. The legal charges were messy and public in the way all moral collapses are. Bank charges and later, indictments for embezzlement. He denied at first. He said words to the press about trials of faith and the weakness of man. Then his bank froze accounts. Investors withdrew their promises. Members left who would not, in the end, defend a man whose hands had been found in both the plate and in the bed of a family's daughter. My mother, the last to grasp the breadth of what had happened, retreated into a small private place where denial and repentance sat opposite one another and refused to make peace. She had been the person most able to love all of us in spite of our faults, and there was something savage about watching that love recalibrate. For weeks she avoided the meetings where her old friends had stood and whispered. Eventually, she stopped attending the Sunday fellowship. The hymnal stayed face down on the table because she could not unfold it. Her faith was not gone. Faith was not something the world could take away, but the shape she had imagined it to be was gone. The Reverend's family cracked in the slow way houses crack, small noises that widen with time. His wife, who had believed in him publicly, left him quietly with a bag of clothes and a look that had loved someone else. His son, a boy I had once given spare change to at the door, could not bear the new eyes on him at school. He left town for a job in another state. The congregation dissolved into two halves, those who would never look at the man the same way, and those who needed to believe their leader because believing was easier than pain. The police found, under close audit, money transferred from the church to accounts connected to a series of renovations that never happened and to a mortgage on a house in a nearby town. They found blank checks signed by his hand and then later rescinded. They found receipts from motels and hotel chains. They subpoenaed ledgers and credit cards. When the indictment came, the Reverend stood in the courthouse with his head bowed in the posture of a man who had finally met a mirror. The town turned on him the way a summer horizon turns on a storm, quickly and with a kind of inevitability. There were rallies and quiet candlelit vigils for those who had been hurt. There were interviews and podcasts and the kind of gossip that has an appetite for ruin. He tried to preach once he got out on bail, and people laughed at the echoes of his words. He had become, in a slow and absolute way, smaller than the pulpit that had once consumed him. I did not dance on his ruin. I never felt like a man who sought her ruin for pleasure. I had wanted only the truth. There were nights I lay awake and ran scenarios in my head where I came forward earlier, where we never lost the congregation, where my mother never had to face the ledger. I saw them all like shadows and chose, in the end, to live in the one that offered repair rather than perpetual assault. In the months that followed, we repaired what we could. It was not easy. Money had to be returned in some cases. Donors demanded transparency. We held community meetings that were raw and laced with questions no one wanted to answer. The church itself was a different thing now. Committees replaced sermons. Audits replaced raptures. People who had once come for altar calls now came for counseling and for bowls of stew. It was more humble. It was quieter. It was the kind of place that did not pretend its roof was sound until it had checked the rafters. My mother took to the back of the church at first, and then to the front. I watched her relearn her body in the house of God. She walked through the doors like a person who had been burned, and decided that the smell of smoke was not the same as the smell of sign. She started singing again, at first in a voice so frail I could hear each note break like light through glass, and then, in time, as if the doors themselves were learning to open wider for her. The Reverend was convicted on charges that combined slow avarice and violations of trust. The law does not and cannot tend to the deeper cuts. It cannot make a child forget the look on a beloved's face when she realized that her protector had not been protecting. It could, however, remove his finances, make him explain himself in public channels, and ensure he could never again stand in a pulpit without new brands of mistrust ripping through the air. He was sentenced to a term, and for some that did not feel like enough. For some, it was precisely the end the world would allow. In the end, he had nowhere to go where he was not a cautionary tale. Former parishioners called him a wolf. Some prayed for his redemption. His name became a lesson in trust. There were times he called me from a gray room behind glass and said my name with a voice that had been drained of the practiced gentleness it once used on my mother. I did not answer. He had asked once, before the hearings, "What do you want?" I had told him coolly, "Only what you took back, truth." He had smiled then like a man asking a child for a toy. I wondered, in that flash, if he had understood what truth costs. I rebuilt. I stayed. I sanded the pews myself on cold mornings and sat by the window with a mug if there was no one else. People gradually came back. Some left for other churches with their hurt like a new religion. Others returned with the quiet hunger that a cup once full of something else now knows. I led the fundraiser for the roof and did not take a single minute of glory. I walked the neighborhood at night to check the lock and the light, as my father used to, and sometimes I felt edges of his humor in the air as if he were standing in the pantry, stealing a biscuit. My sister moved away for a time and then came back as someone who had learned how to live in the shadow of a scandal and still grow a life. She did not marry and did not join the ministry. She painted in spare afternoons and sold little canvases to people who had been in the pews the day the sermon changed. She never forgave the Reverend in words, but in small deeds, a dinner cooked for an elderly neighbor, a blanket sewn for a child. She made amends to the world in a way one cannot always do with apologies. The Reverend's fall was not a spectacle I enjoyed. It was a necessity, like cutting away dead flesh to allow the body to heal. He was punished by law and by the slow erosion of affection. He lost house and wife, and then the favor of the town. He took, in the end, the kind of loneliness that teaches nothing except the hollowness of celebrity. The men who had once nodded in agreement with him found themselves asking for refunds on their trust. There were nights I would stand on the church steps and watch the streetlights burn and think about the way prayer had felt before this. Faith is a strange thing. It does not vanish because of one man's greed. It is elastic and stubborn in the way a tree keeps growing through storm. But faith also changes shape when a hand that once fed you reaches for the cake and takes it. Years later, when the quiet had become the church's ordinary state again, a woman came to me and pressed a paper into my hand. It was a letter from a man in another state who had read of our small town scandal and wrote to say he had stepped down from his ministry upon reflection and had found his way to volunteer at shelters and food banks. "We needed this reckoning," he wrote. "It is ugly, but it made us realize what we were worshiping." I kept the letter in my Bible. My mother died quietly years after the trial. No one could say she died of broken trust. She died because she was tired and because time allows us all to go. Her funeral was held in the same church with fewer candles and a more careful liturgy. People came who had been there the day my life turned. Some wept, others sang. I read the same scriptures I had once heard her hum in the kitchen, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something like completion. I do not tell this story for applause or pity. I tell it because there is a certain grammar to betrayals that are both moral and intimate. They need to be translated into words so the living can tell the dead they did not leave in vain. I tell it because I want the record to show what can happen when you mend rather than rip, when you choose public truth over private rumor. If there is a moral here, it is not exotic. It is that trust can be given and taken, but you can reclaim what was yours not by matching the sin in kind, but by refusing to be small in the face of it. The Reverend took my family's money and used our hearts as a pillow. The law took his freedom. The town took his voice. His own life became a parable he never wrote willingly. I rebuilt the church not to revenge, but to repair, and perhaps that is the quietest vengeance that will stand the longest. A life remade where a life had been exploited. Some nights I stand in the dark doorway and taste the garlic and the hymn on the air and remember my father's laugh. I think about how small the world seems when you are young and how hard it is to learn that people you trust can fail you. But I also think about how difficult it is to build again and how satisfying it is to watch something fall away that had never deserved to be yours in the first place. I did not want to be the man who burned a life down in sport. I wanted to be the man who would not let a lie stand in the house where my father had worshipped. In the end, I did not need to shout. I only needed to show.